In this video, we discuss how to manage chaos with digital governance. And I speak with Lisa Welchman, digital governance consultant and coach, author, and co host of the Surfacing podcast. Welcome to How to Business. I'm Frederick Weiss, and in this episode, we are speaking with Lisa Welchman, digital governance consultant and coach, author, and co host of the Surfacing podcast. Lisa, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Frederick. I appreciate being invited.
I appreciate you joining. Do you mind telling our audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a management consultant, you mentioned, who specializes in digital governance. And that means that I help teams figure out and design collaboration models so that they can get work done intentionally, not unintentionally, not accidentally, but intentionally with the very specific goals.
That correlates to our topic, which is how to manage chaos with digital governance. First off, what exactly is digital governance and what is the managing chaos part, Lisa?
Yeah, well, I thought of managing chaos because anyone who works on a digital team knows that it can be a chaotic environment. And, I've been working in this space since 1995, and it's been chaotic since then. I thought it would happen faster, that things would smooth out faster, but obviously I'm wrong. But digital governance is really creating a framework for an organization. It's a collaboration model that's around decision making. So, usually, when teams are really, really struggling, the real challenge isn't necessarily workflow or other things like that, or even whether or not they're working in an agile environment or a waterfall environment. It's that there's a lack of clarity around who has to make decisions about certain things. And those certain things usually start with some basics like what is digital? If you ask someone inside of an organization, if you ask three people, you'll get three different answers about what digital might be. If you ask them who makes decisions about writing the digital strategy, you might get slightly different answers. And if you ask questions about who's responsible for writing guidance, things like policies and standards, style guides, accessibility policy, taxonomies, server and infrastructure rules, all of those sorts of things. Those are all decisions that need to be made. And a lot of times, organizations and teams have not figured out who makes those decisions. So, what happens is, as they work on projects, right, all these decisions need to be made in a project context and they start fighting about them. Right.
Mm.
And so a governance framework steps out of the project environment and then looks at these things more objectively and says, who actually should be making decisions about these things? Who has the knowledge to write a style guide? Who has the knowledge to set the standard for taxonomy? Right. And it makes those things clear so that when teams are working together, they can focus on getting the work done and they can work fast or slow. That's up to them because they know who makes decisions about key things.
So, would you say then it's about aligning teams and having the same goal, collaboration, keeping users safe, having a foundation of the way that an organization does things?
Yeah, that's an interesting set of things that you just mentioned. It's about all
Mhm.
of those things. The framework is about being clear about what the team does, right? And what the roles and responsibilities are for the teams around that very, very discrete list. And so the result of being better organized and the result of having shared ways of working and having clear decision making is that you can be more intentional about what you're doing and you're not going to make mistakes about things, right? Or you're not going to have as many surprises. Oh, we created this functionality and we didn't realize that the data was being handled this way. And that has a bad outcome for a user. Things like that are less likely to happen in an environment where there's a governing framework and where all of the rules have been considered. And and I also want to say as well, it's we're not talking about rule bound, right? Everybody's operating against a shared set of rules inside of an organization, right? Those rules are either clearly articulated or they're just floating out in the ether of the organization. There are all these assumptions around what they think people think they should be doing and who should be making decisions. So, this is really just about clearing it up and having those important conversations. And doing that will allow people to make clearer, cleaner, and better choices, which will create a better user experience.
I kind of get from what you just said that there may be points where there's friction when this concept is introduced. Is that fair to say? And if so, what is that friction
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
or
I mean, I've
apprehension?
Sure, sure. There's a lot of apprehension around the word governance, right? It's a heavy word, it's a bureaucratic sounding word. And I've stuck with it over the years because that's what I mean. And I'm intentional about that. And I think we're seeing some of the outcomes of poor governance out in our world, in the social media environment, in the website environment, just sort of bad experiences for users. And reasonable governance as well. There's not everything that's online is bad. But there's a lot of friction against that. A lot of times, teams will really blend together the idea of governance and operations. So there's a lot of resistance behind it because they think that in designing a governance framework that you're actually going to slow them down or stall them operationally. And that's not true. One of the first things that I try to do when I work with people is help them pull that apart. Whether you're working in an agile development environment or still old school traditional waterfall or some kind of blended weird environment that you all made up yourselves in terms of getting work done, that's really not the concern of governance, right? Whatever that environment is, it's going to benefit from understanding who decides what the design standard is, right? Who decides what type of content management system we use, what type of editorial voice and tone we use for social media, how we handle our data. All of those things are required no matter how fast or slow you work. So people are resistant to governance because they think that it's going to put all this stuff into their workflow process, but it's not. It's actually going to clarify things. So if you do work in an agile environment, you maybe can actually work a little bit faster and you don't have to be so concerned about having bad or unintentional outcomes because people hadn't considered the
Mm.
work more holistically.
Speaking of unforeseen outcomes, and to make it clear to the audience, what are some examples of unsafe or unethical products or services?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are big ones in the news like algorithmic bias or people's personally identifiable information being used for business purposes that they didn't know they were going to be used for when they signed up for a service, either through lack of clarity or because people inside the business hadn't thought they were going to do that and then they decided to later on, which is what I think happens a lot in the social media space. So I think there are a lot of examples of those types of things that happen, and I think that businesses can be more ethical, but fundamentally speaking, I think the biggest challenge around this, and just started teaching a media ethics course at a university in Austria, and so I've actually
Hmm.
been thinking a lot about ethics and business and digital in particular, because everybody's screaming, I'm an ethicist or digital ethics. Everyone's talking about it, but what I find is that most people who work on digital teams don't even have a concept of what an ethic is. Right. So my background was that
Yeah.
I was a philosophy major and I spent a lot of time thinking about ethics. And so this kind of harks back into my wheelhouse of governance, which is how can you do something intentionally if you don't know what your intent is? Right? So how can you
Ooh.
be ethical if you don't know what your company's ethic is around the use of personally identifiable information? I'm in Europe now, so GDPR, there's certain things you can and cannot do, but there's after that, there's all kinds of things your business can still do. Do you have an ethic around that? Have you considered what your values are? And have you taken those values and understood how they might provide opportunities or how they might constrain what you design and what you put online? And I would argue that most companies don't do that. They just sort of have their general corporate ethic. And because the business of digital has been fast, 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 and push, 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 people just put things online without considering that. And because digital itself is still relatively new to businesses, sometimes we have no concept of the harm that might happen, right? Because we're just
Mm.
inventing, right? So we have no idea, and that's no one to blame. I mean, the reality is sometimes we make things and we put them online and we actually are surprised that they've done something that maybe harms people. And so the real test then is, what does a business do? Right? Do you have an ethic? Are there limits to what you're going to do? And on the flip side, are there positive things that you want to put in the environment as well? And so I think one of the first steps that organizations need to do is to actually define what their ethic is and make sure that everyone on the team understands that.
It seems that there's a lot of people trying to get out the MVP, rush the technology without considering those kind of consequences or unforeseen possibilities. These things really need to be vetted, and they need to be vetted by a large group of people, not just one organization in their bubble. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, I think so. I think, one of the things that I think we need to come to terms with as people who work in a digital space is that this has been going on now for commercial web for 30 years,
Yeah.
right? So there are a range of technologies at varying levels of maturity happening right now. So yes, there are a lot of cutting edge, bleeding edge technologies that people are being super innovative and inventing, and you know, they're moving fast and breaking things. But the vast majority of what we do online and what we build for online are getting to be 20 and 25-year-old technologies, right? And ways of communicating with people. Websites have been around for a while. Mobile's even starting to get a little, leggy on it as well as social media. So that's the vast majority of what people are doing online. So I don't buy the argument that speed is required. I think because digital came out of the pocket and those of us who started our careers early in the early days of digital were working really fast. We've built that speed into the culture. And so it might be time to sit back and go, must we move so fast for every single one of these types of technology groups? Do we have time to sit down as a community and consider what we do and do not want to do? And do we want to have standards like the W3C for the technologies that we actually use? But do we want to have ethical standards that we all want to agree to? And how are we going to align around that? And stop pretending that everything's moving fast. People are like, oh, there's just so much. And it's like, yeah, content might be moving fast on a website. It might be changing every day, but nothing about that website infrastructure changes every day, right? It's just content flowing through, which is a big deal. If you're a content strategist, you're writing content, not minimalizing that. But that's not really changing substantively every day. That's just the flow moving. And so I think we really need to differentiate and understand things aren't moving as fast as we think we are. And if we just sort of stop spinning ourselves up and slow down a little bit, we might be able to see that and make some better choices.
Very well said. Thank you so much for that, Lisa. One of the things you mentioned earlier was about teaching, and I want to dive into your online courses, which are found at digitalgovernance.com. So, this is a comprehensive course with over 6 hours of video lessons, quizzes, exercises. Do you mind going into this a little bit and telling us what is in these courses?
I've been working with this course over the past 2 or 3 years, and there's 2 different ways I work with it. It's about 6 or 7 hours worth of content. It's a lot of multimedia, me talking, a lot of quizzes and things like that that folks can check. And the point is to drive you through the process of creating a digital governance framework. So you can either take the course solo as an online course, or there's a version that you can also get a couple of hours consulting with me. And so it's been a lot of fun. The consulting with me one is down, but maybe by the time people look at this, it'll be back up again. And by down, I mean down because I took it down because it was actually pretty popular. And so it was really time consuming and involves my time. But this fall, that one will be back up again and be working with people. So I hope people have a chance to look at it.
For the audience to find it, we have the URL down here. It is at digitalgovernance.com. Lisa, where else can people find more information about you?
I'm easy to find. Just go to lisawelchman.com. And probably the best way to reach me is to tap me on the shoulder on LinkedIn. And I would be remiss not to mention they can listen to the Surfacing podcast, which I co host with Andy Vitale.
Lisa, last question here. If you could provide the audience with some closing words of wisdom.
Oh, some closing words of wisdom. I think I already alluded to them, which is consider where you are in the general maturity path of digital for us globally, right? Slow down, take a few breaths, and consider what you can do to improve the dynamics and quality of the work that you're doing from your desk, whether or not you're a super leader in the C suite or whether or not you're in your very first job as digital. There are always things right in front of you that you can improve and ways that you can work more comprehensively. So that would be my advice.
Excellent. Lisa, thank you so much for joining. Super appreciate it. Absolute honor. I'm so thankful that you had the time to share this with me and provide your insight. I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Frederick, for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you.